Get to know Terry Hayes on News Radio WGAN.
All right. Well, welcome to the WGAN candidate interview discussion. We have Terry Hayes here joining us, talking a little bit more about the campaign as it is seen through the eyes of Terry Hayes, and then learning a little bit more about Terry. I think it's a good opportunity to get to know all these candidates a little bit more than you might see in the debates and the commercials and whatnot. So, Terry, welcome to the studio. It's really great to have you here at WGAN.
Thank you, Matt. My pleasure.
You bet. So we're going to have about an hour together, and we can talk about a lot of things. We'll get to an issue or two, but I want the people who are both watching and listening to this to kind of get to know you a little bit better. So why don't we just start off by giving us a little life history here? I mean, give us the Terry Hayes story. Why did you decide to jump in? And of course, where did you come from and your dedication to public service over the years?
Well, Matt, I'm a Portland native. I was born right here at Maine Med 60 years ago. I am one of 6 kids. My dad grew up here in South Portland mostly. He got his GED in the Navy in the Korean conflict, and met my mom in Rhode Island when he was a serviceman. And she was an RN. They got married, moved to Portland, and my mom worked at Maine Med.
Mm-hmm.
There are 6 of us. I'm one of 6. I'm number 2. All of us were born in 7 years. My sister Pat,
so it happened pretty quickly then.
My mom converted to Catholicism to marry my dad, and
this is an experience I can relate to. I understand. Yeah.
Okay, so 5 of us are still here in Southern Maine, and we have one sister who moved to Connecticut years ago, and she's the maniac in the family. We define maniac as someone who's born and raised here and moved away. Mm-hmm. So we only have one of those. The rest of us are still here, and we had a little different childhood than most folks. We lived right over in Stroudwater, and on Cobb Avenue. It's very different now. The neighborhood has sort of been taken over by rental car places as the airport has grown.
Sure.
But when we were living there, when I went to elementary school, and I went to St. Pat's, and took the public bus down in kindergarten, got on the bus, because I had a sister who was a year older, and she was the big girl, But I went through the through the 3rd grade at St. Pat's, but my mom got sick early in that year. I don't remember what year it was. I just remember being in the 3rd grade, and I haven't done the math.
Right.
But she came home from work and went to bed in September, and got up when my dad took her to P6 at Maine Med in the spring on Easter weekend. And this is the way I remember it as a 3rd grader.
Sure.
She was diagnosed with manic depression and ended up at AmHigh in Augusta.
Really?
And she was there for years. She was part of the consent decree. So I remember visiting her when, in the old stone building, if you've been on that campus, you can see it from the State House. That was a real difficult part of childhood. And while my dad was a carpenter, and he worked with his hands, and he had 6 kids now that he had to take care of.
It's pretty much all him then at that point.
It was a real challenge. And so we ended up, folks who live in the Scarborough, South Portland area might remember the St. Louis Home for Children, which is in Dunstan Corner on Route 1. It's now been repurposed. It was a convent and I guess somewhat of an orphanage. I mean, it was a children's home. And I went to 4th and 5th grades there. My dad couldn't work and take care of us at the same time.
I was going to say, how did that happen? I mean,
it was something that he arranged so that he could earn enough money to keep the family going, and we would go home. He would come get us on Saturdays, because Saturdays was a half day. He worked 5.5 days a week, basically. Mm-hmm. He would come get us, and we'd go home for the overnight, and then he would bring us back on Sunday nights.
Wow.
It was really hard.
I bet it was.
Even talking about it now, he...
And at that age, too. I mean, that's 3rd grade, certainly you're aware of things, but probably emotionally tough to adjust to something like that happening so quickly.
Well, we understood it, and again, I'm number 2 of 6, so...
So you might have been in one of the better positions out of all the siblings.
He was counting on us to help the little kids adjust to it, which is hard to do when you're in the 4th and the 5th grade. And, I remember him saying to me, he would say to us, look, you can't cry because this is hard enough for me to do, and I'm not going to be able to do. I need to do it, and I won't be able to do it if you cry. So that was hard to hear. So you couldn't cry in front of him about it because I didn't want to make it harder for him. And then the other thing he said that turned out to be very true, which is someday you'll look back at this and it'll just seem like a bad dream. And it does. It is not something I would wish on anyone. I understood why it was necessary at the time. We went home at the end of the summer when I was between 5th and 6th grades because my dad was able to arrange for a family friend to come from Vermont. And so it sounded like we had a nanny, but I wish you could have seen the circumstances.
Yeah.
There was, we were 6 kids. My dad had built 2 bedrooms onto the house, so we were split 3 and 3. And there was an old porch that had been insulated, and that became where that was Donna's room, and Donna took care of us when my dad worked. And you must know that we did a lot of taking care of ourselves, meaning that she didn't do any housework. We were responsible for all that. So at that point, we couldn't afford to go back to the Catholic school, so we went to public school. That was my first. I went to the Longfellow Elementary School.
Was that quite a transition? I mean, I suppose.
What made the 6th grade
depending on the schools, it could be a big change.
What made the 6th grade a challenge for me wasn't that it was public school, but in January of that year, my dad died.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He was working.
So you're how old at that point?
I was 11.
Wow.
I was 11. My sister Pat was 12. She's a year ahead of me. She's the oldest. And we had to go to CCD class because we were in public school, and that's religious education for children that attend public school. And my dad died on a Saturday morning. He was working on the car behind my grandparents' home in South Portland. The jack fell, and he was.
Oh my God! Really?
And
wow, that's pretty much my worst nightmare.
Yeah,
is working on something like that and having that happen.
Don't get under a car. That's where my phobia comes from.
I am on board with that.
There you
go. No more under cars for
me. So that shattered my world even more so than my mom being sick because there wasn't any. I mean, my mother was not in a position to be able to care for us. She was at Am-High at the time, and we weren't old enough to be independent by any means. Pat was 12, I was 11, and Janine was 5, the youngest of my siblings. So we ended up being split up at that point, and my dad.
Really?
Well, we lived with my grandparents and my different aunts, my dad's sisters that lived in the area. So from that point forward, I went to a number of schools. I went to both junior highs in South Portland. One in the 7th and one in the 8th grade because we moved.
Now, when you say we got split up, you're talking about all the siblings went in different places, or you started rotating around some of the different places to live with other family members?
Nobody could take all 6 of us. Think about that.
Yeah, well, no, I get it. I've got 4 kids.
So I have not lived with my younger siblings since my dad died.
Wow.
But we lived with cousins, mostly with family. I mean, I describe myself as being a product of the village. Because there were lots of people who contributed to my character development, including my parents for the relatively short time that we had both of them.
Were you at least able to see them frequently when they're at other places, or did you guys
Pretty
not?
often. I mean, we weren't far. My mom's family lived at a distance, and she was committed to us continuing to be raised as Catholics, and her family was not Catholic. So my dad's family took on that responsibility. My mom's family had a little bit more money, but my dad's family was in the right place. So we lived with my Aunt Mary and her children. She had 5. So it was different times. My Aunt Veronica.
Sure.
And so my cousins' lives were turned a little bit upside down by this too, and they're more like siblings. So we have an extended family but
that's a good thing, though. I mean,
it was.
Yeah, I mean I'm sure you have a pretty good bond with those cousins now.
And with my own siblings, because we get together on a regular basis. I'm very proud of all of them. The 3 older of us have children. The 3 younger of us do not.
Yeah.
But we get together routinely. We do Thanksgiving together. We do the Saturday or Sunday before Christmas together. And we have this great sledding party every February.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, I got to tell you, obviously Catholic, French Catholic myself, and I'm the last of 6 out of my dad was the last of 8. So as I told you on Friday when I was talking to you, I have cousins that are like my parents' age. So I didn't really actually have super close relationships with my cousins. So it's I can imagine how nice that would be. I mean, it's a terrible situation, obviously, but it does build some bonds that are really important. And for my own kids, my sister has 3 kids, and when we moved away, we didn't get to see them very often. And then when we moved back, I saw them on Saturday, and it's nice to have that relationship built there.
It is, and family's really important to me.
Yeah,
very much.
Well,
so.
I can imagine it, with that kind of an experience.
When I say that's the core of my village, Matt. That is my family, and like I said, my aunts and uncles, they gave up some normalcy to have us in their homes, and different of us at different points in time. But it went on. I mean, people. When I was at Macaulay, I went to Macaulay. My aunts got to decide. They'd all gone to Cathedral, so Macaulay was the place to go, and. But my freshman year, the parish paid. We lived in South Portland, and the Holy Cross Parish paid the tuition for students for any of the
like a scholarship kind of.
That was my understanding. Yeah. I mean, I wasn't directly involved in it, but I knew that we were living on Social Security benefits from my dad. But then at the end of my freshman year, my aunt, whom I lived with, got ill, and so. I need to move with my grandparents who lived back in Stroudwater. They were living in the house that we had lived in previously. So the parish didn't pay there. So if I was going to continue at Macaulay, I had to earn my tuition. So my first job was making Egg McMuffins at McDonald's over by the Maine Mall. And I would ride my bike from Stroudwater over to the Maine Mall to open up, because if you make an Egg McMuffins, they open at 6. You're there early, right? And that's what I did for my summers, and saved the money to pay my tuition at school. Showed up my sophomore year with a check the first day of school, and I found out that my tuition had been paid for.
Wow.
By an anonymous donor, at least anonymous to me. And so I was told at the time that I needed to be aware that someone else would be looking at my report card, and I better do well. So I mean, I bet
that was good motivation. Did you ever find out who that person was later on?
I did when I graduated.
Oh, that's great.
I did. And that's so other people who are part of my village. When I was in high school, Mary Perry was one of my teachers. She taught science at Macaulay, and it turned out that it was her parents, the McElhaney's from South Portland, who I considered Mary a mentor. She was active in politics. It was part of where the genesis or the seed was planted in my interest in government and policy and collective action and so forth. And Mary's parents paid my high school tuition for 3 years. I found that out when I graduated. I did well in school, but mostly because if you paid attention, you could kind of be a bit of a pain.
Yeah, sure.
You and I say that because I enjoyed school. I enjoyed learning, and I wanted to make sure I had done my homework so that when I asked a question, I would get an answer instead of being told to go back and read the book.
Yeah,
I
imagine.
So Mary actually took me to the first time I'd ever attended a state convention. She's a Democrat. I went to a Democrat state convention in 1976. Thought, oh my goodness, these are grown-ups? Because funny hats on, noisemakers, all that stuff. It was a fascinating experience for me. But I think it definitely planted the seed around what happens when we gather together in that policy arena in order to meet collective needs. So I consider Mary McElhaney as part of my village.
Everybody always has somebody. I don't know who it is.
Well, and there's a boatload of them.
For everyone, but...
I went off from Macaulay. I really wanted to go to college. When I was little, when my dad was still around, he would sit us down on his knee and look at our report card every quarter. And he'd go over every single grade and explain to us how important it was that we be smart so we could go to college. And this is a man who got his GED in the Navy, okay? But education was absolutely number one for him. And so that ingrained things very early. And I was determined I was going to go to college. I really, really wanted to stay in Maine. But Bowdoin was the only school I applied to in Maine. I applied to 4 colleges.
Was there something special about Bowdoin that made it appealing to you?
I think the thing that was most appealing, this will give you a little bit of insight of me as a teenager, was that the guidance counselor at Macaulay said that I really needed to go. Bowdoin was a male-dominated, Protestant-oriented college.
Right.
And I really should be going to St. Anselm's, or Holy Cross. That was
like a Jesuit school somewhere.
And I don't know that anybody from Macaulay had gone to Bowdoin before.
Yep.
And that's why I needed to go.
This had to be the trailblazer, right?
Well, because it was like, well, you're not going to get in, and it's very selective and all this stuff. Well, I got in, and I wanted to stay in Maine, so clearly that's where I was going to go.
That's interesting.
Did 4 years, graduated from Bowdoin in 1980. If there's anything I would do differently from my college years, there was a real culture on campus where your third year you spent away. A lot of students went abroad.
They still do that, don't they?
They do,
yeah.
But I haven't been there for a long time.
Yeah.
I've been gone since 1980 and haven't been an active alum. But so that third year, either doing it abroad or doing it at another campus. There were sister schools around, in New England and the East Coast mostly. And I said, well, I came to Bowdoin because I wanted to stay in Maine, and I argued with myself, I'm going to stay here now. I'm not going to go. But what it really boiled down to was I was intimidated. I didn't know how to get
at the thought of leaving.
I didn't know how to get a passport.
Yeah.
I knew I needed one if I was going
Right.
to go abroad. I didn't know how to pay for it. I was very integrated into the Bowdoin campus because once I went to college, I stayed there and worked in the summers because I needed to earn the money to help. I mean, I got a lot of financial aid, but all I had was Social Security in addition to that. So I did a lot of the work study stuff. I did a lot of different things as an undergraduate and in the summers on campus. And I didn't leave. I stayed for all.
I would imagine that having the experience you had growing up, that obviously as independent as you had to become, just because of the nature of the life that you lived, that at some point you also kind of wanted to feel like safe in a good place,
right.
that where things work, where I can stay.
That's a very good intuitive piece on your part, because that was home.
Right.
I felt connected. At the time, Walter Moulton was the director of financial aid, and he was one of my favorite people because I always had to fill the forms out by myself. This was when we did them all on paper. We weren't doing them on computer then, and clearly not on the internet. And I would do my best to fill them out, and then I would go in, and he would take the white out, and he would correct everything so that I could go back to school and get the bills paid. And so he's part of my village too.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Chris Potholm, you may have heard of him.
Oh yeah, sure, no Chris well.
Yep. He was I was a government major and an education minor at Bowdoin, and so Professor Potholm and I crossed paths occasionally. I'm not sure either one of us really enjoyed it, but we found a way to laugh.
Did you ever read all of his books? I got several of those on my.
I have read a couple. I don't know if I've read them all because I don't know what all of them consist of, but I've read some.
Yeah, he had a really good one on. He had one that he wrote that was it was pretty much just a glossary of, not only people but terms and some little things that just the
like
unique
Maine
nature,
politics.
the unique nature of Maine politics and just little tidbits on things. I thought that was one of the neater ones that he did, but he also did one called This Splendid Game, which is it took, if I remember right, a few different campaigns. I think at Bill Cohen's first one for the Senate when he rode the bicycle and all that stuff, and kind of told the story of the campaign and how they all went. It's pretty interesting stuff in those stories.
Professor Potholm was an interesting professor, and I took a couple of courses from him, but I needed a recommendation from him when I was graduating because I needed to have two from the area of my concentration, and I asked him for one, and at that time, I'm not sure if they still do this, the form that you had to fill out gave you the option of signing off saying that you wouldn't read the recommendation, that you would. So there was a significant trust element, and I sent him the form, and I hadn't signed off. And he called me, and he said, I don't do this unless you sign off. And I said, I don't trust you. And he said, I wouldn't offer to do this if I couldn't say something good.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, fair enough. So basically you're saying I need to trust you. And I needed it. So I signed the form. And okay. So about a week later in my intercampus mailbox, he sent me what purported to be a copy of his recommendation to me, which was actually, the presumption I make is that it was not. It was in jest. So it was different. I never read the real one.
The actual one.
But I'm certain this wasn't it. And it was hysterical. I mean, I had worked for giving tours on campus for 2 summers. And so he spoke about what a good job I did and how the enrollment went up at Bates and Colby. He talked about how when I worked for campus security that I managed to reduce the number of successful raids by tipping off students ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
And so he had put some time and some thought into this. And I called him to say, this is really funny. And he said, yeah, I laughed when I thought about it. I laughed when I did it. And I'm laughing now. And so we had, it was interesting. And then within 2 weeks, we marched in graduation. And at Bowdoin, what's a really neat tradition is that the entire faculty line, we have graduation outside, and the faculty line, the walkway, and the graduates march, between these 2 rows of professors. And occasionally, someone steps out of line to shake a hand or whatever. So Professor Podholm steps out to shake my hand, and he says, later. To me, and I looked at him and said, much. And didn't run into him again for about, 25 years.
No kidding. Wow.
But I left Bowdoin and went into teaching, taught public school.
So your degree at Bowdoin, was it was teaching or government?
Government and education.
Oh.
Bowdoin had an education program
That's
at the time, and it included student teaching, which I did back at Macaulay. Had to figure out transportation.
So high school level kind of
that's
secondary?
what I did. I was my certificate was secondary social studies.
Yeah.
So
that's where the government stuff came into play a little bit.
Was part of it. It was part of understanding why do we do things the way we do them, what other different systems exist, and I think I know I have a passion for connectedness and being involved at that level. So I taught junior high school up in Oakland.
Oakland.
Yeah.
Wow. For
a couple of years, and then they moved me to the high school, and I taught civics there. But I stayed there for 4 years, and then I went into adult education, and I did that in Gardner and in Scarborough, and then I went to work for the Maine Real Estate Commission as an ed director. By that point in time, my focus had been on adult education and designing curricula and instruction for when adults are your students, because it's different than what you would do with children.
I imagine it is.
And I didn't know a whole lot about real estate, but they figured I could learn that stuff. That was the content stuff. It was the how that they wanted. So I did that for 7.5 years, and that was in the executive branch during Jock McKernan's administration. At the time, Susan Collins was the commissioner for professional and financial regulation, and Real Estate Commission is in that department. So that was when I first met Susan. And I went from there. I became self-employed 7.5 years later and opened my own real estate education business, and I traveled across the country teaching teachers of real estate and doing continuing ed programs for real estate professionals here in Maine and self-study courses.
So you did okay learning the whole real estate gig then?
Yeah, I figured that stuff out. I did. Although I had a sales agent license.
I was going to ask you if you ever thought about getting into actual real estate.
I was never actively engaged in selling real estate, but it was helpful to acquire that credential because of the other work that I was doing. But I was never actively engaged in selling real estate. But while I was doing that, actually it was probably a little bit beforehand, my husband and I met in a bar in Portland in the summer during the Deering Oaks Festival. And it was what's funny about this story is that we met in a bar. We got to know each other. We went to the festival the next day. Schooner Fair was playing, one of my favorites anyway, so we enjoyed that. It was my mother's birthday. So the man that turned out to be my husband met my mother. My mother had come home. She was part of the consent decree. I think I mentioned that. So she came home when I was in high school, early years. My sophomore year in high school, she moved back to Portland, got an apartment, and my sister Pat and Nola, we're the 3 older, we moved in with her. So we took care of my mom from that point forward. And
was she officially a guardian for you, but you were taking care of her? Is that how that worked, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and she,
technically, she was the
grown-up,
the adult and the grown-up. But
yeah, it was an interesting challenge because she would still suffer the the mania and the depression that came, and she was on medication. There weren't a lot of supports in the community at the time, so occasionally she would end up hospitalized. She'd be back on P6, and when that happened, the social workers all got really weirded out because now there were 3 girls at home, and I mean, Pat was a senior, I was a junior, Nola was a sophomore, and they thought that we maybe belonged in foster care.
Really?
So here we are, the 3 of us with our Macaulay skirts on, all right, and our basketball uniforms and cheering uniforms. I didn't cheer, my sister Patty did, and Nola and I played. Honor roll students, and we had to sit them down and say, hey, look,
Yeah.
we are her caregivers
Right.
when she's home, and she'll be home soon. So if you do that, where does she end up? And we're just fine. We don't need to be fixed. So they made us go to family counseling. We said, fine, we can do that. So once a week, whatever, we did that until the counselor said, I'm not really sure why you're here.
Yeah.
We're here because they told us we had to, so just do it.
Yeah.
But
So they let you basically stay there on your own after meeting those requirements.
Correct. They didn't pester us about that. We didn't necessarily. I mean, I'm not sure what would have made a difference, but we were okay.
Is there any likelihood that would happen today? I'm not in the mental health profession, obviously, but I mean, would they allow?
It's interesting. It may simply from a resource perspective.
Sure.
But it probably would have a different structure around it. I mean, they literally just left us alone because I presume because there were other youngsters who required their attention more. And truly, there was no support from my mom if we weren't there. So think about what happened. My sister Pat graduated high school, stayed in Portland, went to college, got married. And then I left and I went to Bowdoin. And my sister Nola's there, so Amy moves in. So the younger kids, are. So anyway, it was still a transition. And I say this because by the time Steve and I met, which was 1984, so I was
a little bit after you graduated
4
college.
years out of college. The second day that I knew this man, he met my mother. Because we were celebrating her birthday. At
quite an introduction, I imagine.
Exactly,
Yeah.
And it didn't, and he didn't bat an eye.
There you go. That's the keeper right there.
So,
right?
So 2 days later, we decided to get married, and so far we've been married for 34 years.
Nice.
I have 3 grown kids, and I remind him occasionally he's still my first husband, just so that we keep things straight. But he's actually been immensely supportive.
Options are always open, right?
Well, exactly.
I imagine that's quite a story. Obviously, I imagine that those formative years, as you said in the beginning, you wouldn't wish them on anyone. It's not an experience you would ever want somebody to have to deal with themselves. But they have to have formulated your character in a way that probably, drove you to be a little ambitious, be a self-starter, be in control of yourself, and not have anybody telling you what to do all the time. I mean, you're in charge of yourself, and you had to be like at 12.
Well, it got when Mom was home, especially when I was a senior in high school. My mother, when she was depressed, she didn't want the curtains were down. She didn't want anybody to leave the house, And I had to be able to look her in the eye and say, "Mom, I'm not going any place that you don't know about. I'm not going to be with anybody you don't know, and I'm going to go because I'm not sick.
Mm-hmm.
You're sick, but I'm not sick, so I can go." And I did, But again, and I don't know. If every time I did everything I would have told her about, but I didn't do anything really terrible,
Well, I would have to imagine all that bred a certain level of responsibility in you. I mean, you couldn't really be reckless and survive that kind of an environment.
Too much, right?
Yeah.
So I think if I have a character defect, it's that strive piece that I'm constantly looking down around the bend to try to see what's next to be prepared for it. Which is kind of silly because you can't be prepared for things like what happened to my dad or even what happened to my mom.
But you could be equipped. I mean, that's the important thing, right?
Yeah,
you don't know what it is that you have to be ready for, but
that's
you know that you have the tools that are there for that.
So it's, in a number of ways, I feel blessed because extended family was very, very supportive. And at the same time, there are pieces, things that I don't have, like, we managed, my mom didn't have a home after my dad died. And so the family pictures, we've managed to find them as we pool together with my aunts and my grandparents. But there aren't mementos maybe from my dad or my mom because there was such a gap in time, and who had time to worry about that? We were trying to house and feed 6 kids,
Yeah.
you know. So it makes me value collective effort. You know, I am.
Well, how could you not after that?
I'm a product
Right,
of
yeah.
the village. I want to be a part of others' village, you know, and help them succeed. I think, to me, that's the giving back part. And I'm just convinced we can do this work better.
Okay, so at some point you had the bug. Obviously, early on you had a mentor that brought you to conventions, and you saw the political experience, and you had the social studies background and all that kind of stuff. But at some point you said, hey, I should participate in this.
Oh, I did not say that, Matt.
Well, how did it happen then? How did you get dragged in against your will then?
Here's what happened. Actually, I was at a softball game. My daughter was a softball player.
Nothing
in
good
high
ever
school.
happens at a softball
Well,
game like that.
yeah.
You always
And
get recruited into a lot of things there.
well, I should say before this, when my daughter's our oldest child, when she went to kindergarten, there was an opening on the school board. And although I didn't participate a lot in public school when I was growing up, again, not a decision I got to make, I was a real proponent of the public school system by the time I got done Bowdoin, you know, the education program there. And I wanted to do the best that we could do for all the kids that were there. So I ran for the school board for the first time when Charlie, my daughter, went off to kindergarten.
Did you have a platform when you did this, or did you just want to make a difference?
I had been.
Things you wanted to do?
I was a stringer. See, I had a day job, but in the evenings, I was a stringer for the Sun Journal, and I would go to the public meetings in town and write the stories.
Really?
You know, so I was paying attention. And town meeting and the selectmen meetings and the school board meetings. And so I had some familiarity with it, and I knew there was some real tension in the community because of the costs. So I was interested in being a part of that and seeing if we couldn't bring folks together differently. And I decided to run. I didn't win.
Didn't win.
I did not win, but so that was in November, I think it was November. But anyway, within 2 months, someone who was on the board had resigned. And so the selectmen appointed me because I had lost the last election. Said, well, at least she wants to do it. And that started a 13-year stretch.
You know, it's funny you say that, not to interrupt you, but I've always found in politics that the people that end up being in some of the most important places eventually, they get things for just showing up. And and that doesn't mean that they're not qualified or that they're not interested or that they don't want to make a difference. But, you know, the people who complain about a lot of things all the time are the ones that don't go to the town meetings and they don't express interest and they don't show up. And then the people who do end up getting called when somebody's, you know, resigned or there's an open spot somewhere, and then you get called upon it, and then you get your fingers in it and you're really involved, and suddenly you're making a difference, and then you stick around and you keep running for things and move your way up the ladder, right?
Well, it was 13 years and all the way to, Charlie graduated in 2003. So the entire time that she was in the public school system, I was on the school board. And the philosophy wasn't wanting to do this to make sure my kids get a good education. It was, if it isn't good enough for my kids, it's not good enough for your kids. So let's make sure it's good enough for everybody's kids. So it wasn't about mine. And in fact, my children will tell you why it was such a drag to have their mom on the school board, because they got no
breaks.
No breaks whatsoever. In fact, Charlie will tell you that she only got one detention in high school, and she got it because of her mother.
Yeah.
She left her brother standing in the driveway and drove to school, and because she was going to be late, and they were mad at each other, and I called the school and said, send her back. And they said, well, she's going to be late, and I said, yep. And they said, she's going to get a detention. I said, okay. You know, they got to figure this out. And she kind of served the detention. I think the teacher felt badly for her who had detention duty. But anyway, I mean, there was no breaks. It was, you know, if anything, they were expected to behave maybe better than others. I don't know. But the woman who was representing Buckfield in the legislature at the time was reaching her termed out limit. And so in the spring of her next to the last year was Rosita Gagne. She approached me at the softball game. She had a granddaughter playing and my daughter was playing. And she said, I think you should run for my seat. And you know, at the time, this may sound funny, I didn't even know if I was registered in a party, because when Ross Perot was about, I had registered. I don't remember what the party was called.
The Reform Party, right?
Reform Party.
Well, the first time he ran, it was nothing. He was just unenrolled and everything.
Well, I was a fan, and I joined the Reform Party, and I had no idea what the status of my registration was. Rosita was a Democrat, and she was inviting me to run as a Democrat. And I had never thought about it, Matt. It had never occurred to me to do this. And So I had to research it a bit to find out what it entailed. I was self-employed at the time. So, what would it cost me to do this type of thing? And what would it mean? What would Steve have to do? And the kids were older. Charlie was she was going to graduate from high school and stuff. So I ran in 2004, and I lost. It was another humbling experience. I had really different emotional responses to that campaign because I did everything I was told to do. I knocked on every door and, did the mailers and had my palm card and wrote notes and did all the things and still came in second. So I had a pity party for about 2.5 days, almost feeling shame. Everybody knew that I lost, so I didn't want to go anywhere where people would see me.
They'd see me and then know.
Like a loser, something. And,
Mark of the beast on you.
And I'm thinking, this is the former social studies teacher who was feeling this way. And so I had an aha moment, and it started like this. Well, good God, woman, if you had won, would you run again in 2 years? Probably, if I like the work.
Sure.
Well, what's stopping you from running? So figure out how to win, and do it again. And the other thing that I realized was that in a representative democracy, there are many more losers than winners. Think about that. How many people were running for governor? How many people are running for governor now?
Right.
And should there be any shame for putting your name on a ballot and
never
and providing a choice? But I think,
and some of the most successful and talented politicians of all time have not only lost but lost repeatedly. I mean,
right. Well, it wasn't for me. It was a matter of saying, wait a minute, but I did my civic duty. There wouldn't have been a choice if I wasn't on the ballot, and at least and plus there were a couple of thousand people who had voted for me.
Right.
So who would they have had to vote for? There wouldn't have been a choice anyway.
So do you have not to interrupt your story, but do you have what happened in that race that made you lose if you did all the things you needed to do? Usually, I got to tell you, as somebody who's been doing this for a long time, if I hear I knocked on every door, you usually win. So was it just, did the other person work hard as well and maybe neutralize that hard work of yours? Or
no, he was better known. The four towns in the district were Buckfield, Hartford, Sumner, and Paris, and my rival was a gentleman who was retired, a nice man. His family had grown his boys up in Paris, and his name was Hanley. You may know Dana Hanley.
Sure.
was his dad. Nice gentleman who had retired from the shoe business, from management of shoe business, and I think he had lost his wife, and he was looking for a way to continue to be involved and stuff. And so we were both the choices in 2004 and 2006.
Mm-hmm.
So Paris is the biggest of the four towns. Everybody in Buckfield, Hartford, and Sumner knew who I was because I'd been on the school board for that long and chaired the budget committee. I started moderating town meetings, which is a just sort of fun thing that I like to do. Yeah. And because my kids, had grown up there and everything. So either you liked me or you didn't, but
a known quantity, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
But Paris, I did not know who I was. And I didn't campaign timely. I should have run in Paris that time as if I had a primary opponent, because even I ran as a Democrat. The Democrats didn't know who I was. So what I learned in the 2 years as I sat out, because I ran again in 2006, was I learned how to figure out which doors I should be knocking on. Not knocking on all of them.
Quality more than quantity.
Well, as many as 25% or more don't have a registered voter in them. And as much as my ego might want to get out in front of me at times, if you're 40 years old and you haven't registered to vote yet, the chances that you're going to register to vote, show up, and vote for me are pretty slim.
Yeah.
I'm willing to represent you once I get the job, but you can't help me get the job,
right.
Was the way I framed it. So I would focus on those homes that had registered voters and where they actually voted.
Mm-hmm.
So I built a database from getting the voter list from the four towns and the voter history, because they keep the documents of the checkoff sheets when you come in to vote from year to year.
Sure do.
So
high propensity voters.
I with some help from some volunteers, I literally built an access database that my sister Nola then taught me how to use, and I targeted and I knocked on all the right doors, and I won by 15 votes, Matt.
15 votes.
1-5, right? So don't let anybody tell you that your vote doesn't matter.
Right?
It was, and kudos to Mr. Hanley. It wasn't because I had any axe to grind with him, but in a representative democracy, you get elected for a term, and then you have the voters have another say.
Yeah.
And I gave them an option, and I think for years I've said it's the Jack family up in North Buckfield, because I think there's 15 of them, and I think I got all their votes, and I think they're the ones that put me over the top.
Yeah, probably. Well, that was also a good year for Democrats to run too. I mean, there's had to be a little bit of extra energy on that side. Well,
here's the difference, Matt. In 2008, I won by 1,200.
Yeah.
So there was a real difference. I mean, in terms of
that's a presidential year.
A blue wave then, but it was.
Well, I can tell you, it was not exactly a popular year to be a Republican in 2006. It was not a good year for us, shall we say that?
Well, I understand, because I remember the numbers when I got to the legislature, but that was the beginning of my legislative service, and it was very different campaigns each time, but I was successful and was reelected and served a total of 4 consecutive terms.
And you moved into leadership, and you got, I think, a lot of experience there. What did you, as you look back on your time in the legislature and what you saw there, I think there's probably a lot of lessons that you drew from what you saw and what you experienced. But what's your big takeaway from legislative service in general? Relationships
matter. When you're doing that work in the legislative branch and how the legislative branch interacts with the executive branch, relationships matter. This is a relationship business. Mm-hmm. We're all paid, our salary and our expenses are paid by the taxpayers for the state of Maine. There's a team sport aspect to this, but it shouldn't be to the death. Okay, mm-hmm. I think you put your best effort forward to be persuasive, and at the end of the day, the decisions that are made in that policy environment are really a simple math problem. You either got more votes on the other side or you didn't. And if you prevail, then you go about implementing those decisions. If you didn't win, you don't stand in the way of them. You take that on yourself. That's on me. If I'm inadequately persuasive, I'm not going to blame you, Matt, because you voted the other way. I'm going to take another crack at it and say, okay, I wasn't able to get Matt. Wonder if I come at this differently. Maybe there's some additional information or data I can bring to the fore. That's on me. Mm-hmm. That's a different perspective than blaming everybody else when something goes wrong. I think I've learned that I'm more in charge of where I end up than what anybody else is doing mm-hmm. and saying about that. So I think the relationships are core. The other thing that I've watched change that I'm very concerned with is that we don't stop campaigning on election night anymore. Now, you think about it, campaigns are competitive by nature and by definition. There's only going to be one winner, right? Well, on election night, again, we do this simple math problem. We add up the votes, and whoever got the most votes has now got the task of governing, some in the legislative branch or in the executive branch as the governor. And what I watch is that the leadership now doesn't stop campaigning on election night. They manage the governing process for political advantage, not necessarily for policy outcomes that benefit Mainers. Mm. And I would like to stop that. Yeah. I want to hit the reset button.
It is fun. I heard it put a certain way the other day. It was that you spend all your life running for these offices, and then once you get them, it's like you don't even want to do the job that you got.
Well, I want
you're waiting for your next race, right?
I want your listeners and viewers to know that I want to do the job as Maine's governor. And what will my priority or style coming into this is to cultivate relationships with the legislature in order to make that successful. And I can offer this, that I'm Maine's first independent state treasurer elected by the legislature. The state treasurer, the attorney general, and the secretary of state are elected each legislature, so every 2 years. And one of the first things that the legislature does after they're sworn in is elect the constitutional officers. And
do you like that system, by the way? That the legislature does it instead of a statewide race or an appointment by the governor?
Changing it is not a priority of mine. Yeah. There are other things that I think are more important, to be honest with you, but it's done differently. There are 4 states that do it. We're a total of 4 that do it the way Maine does, and there are some where the treasurer is appointed by the governor and others where it's a statewide elected. Mm-hmm. So there's no one right way would be the short answer, I guess. Yeah. But up until 2014, every state treasurer elected by Maine's legislature represented the party with the most votes when you put the House and the Senate together. And I was the first independent elected, which took coalition of Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. And both in 2014 and 2016, when I was reelected, I was up against a Democratic alternative, and the Democrats had the votes. They could have elected their own, but they elected me instead, working with the Republicans again and the Independents. So I offer that as a sense of trust that folks whom I had worked with in that environment knew that I was going to work this straight. It wasn't going to play favorites, wasn't going to ration information, and that they could trust me in managing the state's finances. And I'm an independent wanting to be Maine's next governor for the same reason. I want to earn the trust of the electorate. And like I said, hit the reset button so that the partisanship doesn't get in the way.
You know, you highlight your sort of your personality as an independent, and what I think a lot of listeners to this would be interested in is to kind of chart how you arrived at that place, because you look at Senator Collins, you look at a number of Democrats that, though I think it's a shrinking number, are still kind of independent-minded, but with a party registration, still in one of those camps. What ultimately drew you to sort of abandon the party system and to become an unenrolled voter and an independent and run for governor in this way and be treasurer this way?
Well, my direct experience in the legislature, and when I was in legislative leadership, I was the assistant leader of the House Democrats when we were in the minority from 2010 to 2012, at the very beginning of Governor LePage's first term. I served with Emily Kane. Emily Kane was the leader at the time. And so I got a chance to see the inside picture of not just leadership within the legislature, but within the party. And what I saw bothered me. Both parties have relationships with allies, different groups or interest groups or organizations in the community whose priorities align more closely with one philosophical perspective than the other. I don't have any problem with interest groups. You know where they're coming from. They should ask for whatever they want, okay? But there are times when they ask for things that are what I would call outside the boundaries. And when I was serving as a leader in the Democratic House and watching the Democratic Party, we didn't say no when we should. And there were a couple of different examples of that, and that made me terribly uncomfortable enough that I was determined to enhance my leadership cred. So worked really hard during the 2012 campaign cycle for the Democrats to win the majority back in the House, raised a ton of money, and we were successful. And I had aspired to leadership within that new majority, and I was unsuccessful at that. Okay. Didn't stand to get in the way, but watch then what did we do with that newly won majority, and was disappointed that it was predictable. We continue to do some of the same things. And that was the challenge for me. I didn't think they were right. I was I don't know, loud and obnoxious, but I was persistent inside the party trying to change it, and I was unsuccessful, Matt. So I had been elected as a Democrat. I felt that the communities that I represented, that was sort of truth in advertising at the time. I didn't leave the party until my legislative service was over, because I felt that I owed it to them, if you will. But it was very clear to me that going forward, I was going to be an independent. I didn't experience the same challenges up close on the Republican side because I wasn't a Republican. But I've observed it from the outside and would suggest that similar challenges exist. But I can't be as critical because, again, I wasn't as close
that individual experience.
Right.
Sure.
But, at the end of the day, many of the things that the Republicans accused the Democrats of was actually true. I thought, and
vice versa.
Right. And so we know that, and we're not willing to change it. What's wrong with this picture? I do not believe in the ends justify the means. I think how we do things really matters, Matt. And I would say that I've tried to live that in my life. I'm not perfect by any means. I'm human like everybody else, but at the end of the day, how we treat each other in this process, I think, like I said before, relationships are really key. And right now we're in a box that I'm very uncomfortable with. It's the us versus them box, and I'm encouraged to hate my neighbors depending upon how they voted. And, I live in Buckfield, Maine. I'm not going to hate my neighbors. I depend on them. They depend on me. People
That
can
seems
think
to be
differently, and I'm not going to get mad at them.
That seems to be an increasingly rare opinion, to be completely honest. When you look at what's happening in society, that's the minority opinion now, is that the other guy is not actually evil and is not terrible, and maybe they disagree with us, but they're not that bad. It seems to be that's what we think now.
Well, yeah, I would agree, and that's another reason why I think it's so important to have a Hayes administration following the LePage administration.
Sure.
because I think we can hit the reset button on that. I don't despise the parties. I think that the way we're executing them is not in our best interest right now, and I don't think a partisan in the chief executive role is going to be able to help us break out of that. And I think that's in our best interest going forward. It's why I have a passion for this campaign.
Well, this might sound like a little bit of a philosophical question, I guess, but I think it's important because if you're going to break the system and try to start over and have more of you have the civility pin on, right? To have a more civil, respectful, and better government going forward, I think we have to do a little diagnosis on why it's like this. Why do you think we've arrived at this place? Like, what's really causing the partisan rancor to be quite so bad, and to have the extremes quite so loud, and to have the vitriol so stark?
Well, I would suggest that part of this probably rests with Governor LePage. He has a very
but do you see it's just him? I mean, it seems like a nationwide problem.
I'm going to tell you the difference. Well, I can't. I'm a Mainer. I'm going to solve Maine's problems. I'm not sure. I'm not asking to take on the national piece, but I'll work with our federal delegation. And frankly, I think by and large we're well represented outside of that frame, if you will, looking at the folks that we send down to D.C. to do our work. But for me, it's a combative, take no prisoners, my way or the highway. I don't operate that way. I'm not a pushover. You don't get to where I am because, I took the easy route. That's not the way this happened at all. I would say right now, if the partisanship and this kind of wrestling is working for you, I'm probably not going to win your vote by November 6th. But if it's not, and if you're frustrated that the costs of state government continue to go up, but the outcomes across the board seem to be diminished, then I want to invite you to trust me and give me your vote on November 6th, because I know we can do this. I did it. I've worked with Governor LePage. I don't hate the man. He's smart. He's done some things that have really benefited Maine. Unfortunately, most of us won't remember those details in his legacy because of other ways that he's chosen to perform his role as governor. And that's on him. Those are his choices. But I haven't spent my legislative career and my career as state treasurer, saber rattling with the governor in the newspapers. To what end? When I need something from him, we figure out a way to get it. Okay. And it's not in the headlines. I think the relationships matter. I don't hate him. I don't think he's the worst thing that ever happened. I'm saying that if we want to cement that partisan approach, then elect another partisan. You pick. If you really think that we can do this better, because we have previously, but we don't have to hate each other. I mean, we've had two branches of government at war with each other for 6 years.
Well, okay, so that's a good segue into kind of where I'm going with this, because I happen to be of the mind, and maybe I'm wrong, but I happen to be of the mind that a really good person who becomes governor can be completely taken hostage by the rest of what they experience in state government because of the larger societal issues I'm getting at. The reason I asked you about the national stage, too, is that it feels like people who have the style of Governor LePage, including the president, including a number of other governors and senators that you see across the country, they're more the symptom than the disease. They're not a causal agent. They're the things that are responding to how the voters are feeling. And it seems like the voters are increasingly angry at each other, and they're just increasingly mad and vitriolic about the other guy. And I don't know if that's a media environment thing, if we're all in our closed silos. I mean, if it's that a social media has curated our lives to the point where we're not even seeing the other person exists. I don't know what it is, but what I'm worried about is that somebody like you, who I respect a great deal and think is a good person who wants to make a difference, is going to end up with a Republican Party and a Democratic Party that want to kill each other, and they don't play by the same rules.
Well, see, in the early years when I was in the legislature, the leaders that were elected by the caucuses were actually friends with each other.
Yeah, that's not true anymore.
Well, but it can be. And
Sure.
that's what I'm saying, Matt. That's why when you ask me, what's the biggest takeaway from my legislative service? Relationships matter. Okay? And so, the governor is the leader for the state of Maine, not in the legislative branch, but working in partnership with the legislature. This is the way I see it. So I will tell you that I look to have good working relationships across the board with whomever the caucuses elect. Right now we have 5 caucuses in the legislature. Who knows what we'll have after November 6th. But my intent is one-on-one, meet with them early on, share legislative priorities and policy priorities, and figure out how we're going to work together. And at the end of the day, Matt, I'm going to give them all the credit because it doesn't matter to me. I'll know. I mean, every day I get up and go to work right now as your state treasurer trying to restore trust in government. That's what's important to me. I have this fantasy that I will live in a world with enthusiastic taxpayers. I knew I would get a laugh out of you.
Yeah, you will.
Right.
You know who you're talking to.
So why don't we have enthusiastic taxpayers now? Well, in large part, it's because those of us that have been doing the governing have not been governing in a way that engenders trust from the public that's paying the bills. If that's my fantasy, that's why I get up and go to work every day. I'm trying to make sure that as your elected official, you and your listeners, you're paying my salary right now as a state treasurer. I want to make sure the decisions I'm making are the best decisions for all of Maine. I want to engender trust from my staff. I want the consumer service and customer service that we provide to do that. And if you think that it's tough just, barking up against the wall that says partisanship isn't going to save us, you've got to imagine trying to restore trust across the electorate, but that's my goal.
It's a big job.
And I will suggest to you that they haven't managed to chew me up and spit me out yet. So I think
haven't run away screaming yet, have you?
I think that a Hayes administration is Maine's best bet, not for dismantling the parties. That's not what I'm looking to do. I want to put the relationships back into place. We're going to have philosophical differences, and thank goodness. I mean, how boring would it all be if we all agreed? But the fact that we can't listen to people who see the world differently and learn something from them, in those conversations. Instead, we're doing this. We're saying, oh, no, they're evil. They've got 3 heads and horns. No, they're our neighbors, and when the chips are down, we remember that. I think we need to remember that when the chips are up. And right now, the chips are up. Yeah. So, why can't we enjoy that with our neighbors and be respectful? And at the end of the day, do the simple math problem. Either what you wanted to happen, won or it didn't, and then you go back to work, you know.
I think there is a real desire for the general public to see that. It's just, I count me a cynic. I mean, I
love that I'm going to have to win you over, Matt.
Yeah, well, I want that world to exist. I really do, because romantic thoughts in my past about the way government used to operate when, you had Newt Gingrich and President Clinton sitting there signing bills left and right, and the economy was good and everybody was happy in the 90s. It felt like at least it worked, and it's not something that I think most of us have experienced for quite a long time. So,
well, Matt, like I said, I'm sitting here as Maine's first independent state treasurer, elected and reelected in that office by a divided and partisan legislature. Okay, and I offer that as my credentials to say we can do this, and I'm determined to do it differently. Because I don't want to hate my neighbors, and I don't want our policymakers to be, in that mode. And basically, that means respecting the process. The process they're in place. That's the level playing field. And when we go through this policymaking piece, I will respect the process. As Maine's next governor, I'm going to. My commissioners and the experts within the executive agencies will be available to participate in policy development with the legislative committees. And I will insist that they be treated with respect, but I won't pull them out of that process as a solution to that problem. I don't think that was wise. I think that's part of how we end up with a significant tug of war around the veto piece. If the administration, the executive branch, isn't participating in the policy development, there's much more reason for there to be objections at the other end, by the time it gets to the governor's desk. My goal would be to be a part of that process and make sure that the expertise from the executive branch is available. to the legislature, recognizing that sometimes the executive branch position will be persuasive and other times not so much, but we'll be at the table participating in the process. I think that'll be a significant change. And it's not to go in, I'm not faulting the parties per se, but the way they're being implemented is divisive. There aren't enough of us to fight like that. We have limited resources. We'll do a much better job if we start at those things we agree and work forward from there, and recognize that we can disagree without being disagreeable and without, the tribalism that isn't getting us what we need.
Seems to be the theme of your campaign overall. So Terry Hayes, state treasurer and candidate for governor running as an independent. I just want to say a quick thank you for stopping by and joining us. It's a unique opportunity for us at WGAN, and I'm sure our listeners, to hear a little bit more about where so much of what you talk about comes from, and what your experience has been, because that, I think, really does lend itself to understanding what you want to do and how you want to do it a little bit better. So I just want to say a quick thank you for joining us here at WGAN. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate the opportunity.
And make sure you stay tuned for more from WGAN.